So this week we discussed Heidegger's uh, contribution to our discussion of death, and we looked mostly at his work, Being in Time, to see um, what his argument is, what his perspective is on that. I think about uh, the idea of death, the experience of it, or the anticipation of it. Um, Painful, and certainly most of us have memories about it, and in case of other people, be the source of tremendous anxiety. And if you think about grief, it's one of those emotions. Is it even an emotion? Is it a state of consciousness? What is it? It's not really an emotion like other emotions. So, you know, um, when one's going through it, other people don't know how to react to it. Uh, the eminent psychiatrist Carl Jung uh, considered that one of our deepest uh, complexes was the fact that at a certain point when we're going through life, we realize that we're finite. Um, and for Jung, that sets up a real problem for us because at the same time, we want to be infinite. We want to keep going. We want to live. And so that conflict, he argues, is one of our most profound issues, one of our most profound conflicts. This conversation was really sparked again, anew in a philosophical way, I think. Last year, a wonderful doctor, B.J. Miller, who works um, in the hospice field, but also in palliative care, wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times, and in it, he talked about the different types of death, which is, from a medical point of view, fairly straightforward. The cessation of, cardiovascular functions or brain waves and so forth. But then he very quickly moves on to consider other issues regarding death and other perspectives on it. He delves into I guess, the physicist's perspective or the biologist's perspective, or even the ecologist's perspective that our body will break down, and although our physical organism dies, the law of conservation in physics being what it is, the various microelements of our body will decompose and reformulate and become other kinds of things, other kinds of substances. So there's that kind of interesting perspective on it. Then he also talks about the cultural perspectives on it, and certainly the religious perspectives on it, and way, I don't have to tell you, of course, deep into antiquity, the ancient Egyptians, their tombs, their elaborate rituals of death, believed in an afterlife, and in our religious rites, many religions have a reenactment of a descent into darkness, and then a kind of rebirth into the light, with the analogy, the famous analogy used by Jesus of the seed that falls to the ground. Of course, it needs to die in order to really reach its telos as fullness of life. So these kinds of perspectives are part of our universal history, actually, when it comes to coping with death. The philosopher Plato investigated this question and used analogy on a number of occasions, in the course of his dialogue, used the analogy of sleep, something we're all so familiar with, and the idea of, kind of tying with the idea of rebirth and what have you. But this is, and these are, powerful arguments, and there are different perspectives that we can take on death that kind of resurrect, excuse the pun, but resurrect the idea that there's, beyond the facticity of death, there's a kind of eeriness to it, right? I mean, Teilhard de Chardin, the great archaeologist and theologian, thinker and whatever else you want to call him. I was fascinated with the the ancient quality of rocks, the magnitude of the time that they were sitting in a place, on a ledge somewhere that he was studying. And he would just look at rocks, various types of rocks, and marvel at the fact that this thing would be here for eons and eons of time, and had been there for eons and eons of time. And yet human consciousness is just so fleeting. And although it doesn't spell it out, the kind of disconnect there between those two realities. One, human consciousness, the pinnacle of creation, arguably, and the other, a kind of lifeless rock that just kind of stares back like a gargoyle, mocking human finitude. Writers, our great writers, have delved into this, of course, in various ways. They've written about plagues and death, and Albert Camus, the French existential writer, in his work, The Plague, has some very intriguing things to say about death, especially the death of the other. But Martin Heidegger, in the course of his work, Being and Time, really delves deeply into this question. Now, you might remember from your awareness of Heidegger that the very title of his work suggests that time is deeply involved in just about everything he's going to say. And so it is true also about death. For Heidegger, death puts us in touch with a perspective on time that's more than a perspective. It defines really the human condition. So let's take a look at what Heidegger has to say about being and death in Being and Time. Now, he says, to get us started, he says the existential interpretation of death takes precedence over any biology and ontology of life. Okay? It simply reflects the fact that when Dasein dies, and even when it dies authentically, it does not have to do so with an experience of its factual demising, or in such an experience. In other words, strictly speaking, and many others have commented on this, we don't actually experience our own death. That's left for others. He says we can, the existential analysis that he's going to provide involves setting forth the ontological structure of Dasein's being toward the end. So what does he mean by that? Heidegger wants us to think about this interesting distinction that he makes between the ontic and the ontological. The ontic is the world of public policy, descriptive medical analyses of things, maybe a litany of our psychological complaints or physical complaints, right? The ontological refers to the fact that we are, right? It is that without which nothing else would be, right? The form anything else of an existence. So that's what he wants to contrast. An ontic approach with an ontological approach, something which, you use the analogy of the elevator, goes all the way down to the basement, where our existence is grounded and is looking to unearth, what it finds there. As potentiality for being, he writes, page 294 in this John Macquarie edition, Dasein cannot outstrip the possibility of death. Death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Dasein is the human being. Thus, death reveals itself as that possibility which is one's own most, which is non-relational, and which is not to be outstripped. Dasein, that possibility is the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Um, Now, he says that death belongs to being in the world, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? Because we tend to think that death is our transit from our being into being in the world to some other state, some kind of inorganic state, some organic state or something. Um, so he says that thrownness into death reveals itself to Dasein in yet a more primordial and impressive manner. In that state of mind which we have called anxiety, okay? Anxiety in the face of death must not be confused with fear in the face of one's demise. This anxiety is not accidental or random mood, but as a basic state of mind of Dasein, it amounts to the discloseness of the fact that Dasein exists as thrown being towards its end. Boy, that's a mouthful, huh? So what does he mean by that? Well, we can be anxious towards this or that. We have an exam coming up or, something important. That's episodic anxiety, but there is for Heidegger a kind of background anxiety, um, you know, uh, and that is something that happens when we're thrown into this world, right? Like a pair of dice. We're thrown into the world that we did not create. It already has meanings and values in play, and that background anxiety. What is it from? We have to go back to Carl Jung. See, we know at a certain point that we're finite, and indeed, a good deal of our energies are spent actually keeping that at bay. Right? I don't want to think about that, and so. But look, you can run, but you can't hide. We do know that's why it's background. It's playing in the back. So we do know that this is out there. And it's out there in a very interesting way. It's there as the horizon. It's there as our future, right? We know that our future has this there. There's this moment of death. So that changes the calculus from our mundane assessment of time to existential time. Existential time is attuned to the fact that we are always ahead of ourselves and the future is preeminent. We're possibility. Higher than actuality stands possibility, right? Because we can make these things come into being, and they are possibilities for us. But with death, we don't have any more possibilities, right? As Wayne Dwyer, the popularizer of Eastern philosophy, once said, it's the sports jacket with no pockets, right? So we don't need any pockets when we do that. But for Heidegger, it's a different story, though, right? So it can't be ausschreibt. In Being Towards Death, he writes, Dasein comports itself towards itself as a distinctive potentiality for being. In other words, I know this is a potential for me. But the self of everydayness is the they self. The they, in quotes, is constituted by the way things have been publicly interpreted, which expresses itself in idle talk. This is a really interesting part of Heidegger's philosophy, this whole business of the they self, of everydayness. It's so close to Hannah Arendt's work on banality that it suggests that perhaps this part of being in time, Heidegger was working very closely with Hannah Arendt. The they self is a really pivotal part of Heidegger's argument. Homage to John Macquarie, Heidegger's translator. Approximately and for the most part, we're always in the they self. We go along with what they think. We take delight in what they take delight in. We value what they value. We assume what they value. In other words, the they self is a part of our ontological equipment. It's how we get around in the world. And the they self is like a facade that masks, really, our true human condition from us. All right? So And this applies to death as well. So death for the day self is ontic, and um, it is termed by Heidegger demise. Right, one will come up with pat phrases. One dies. Well, what can you do? They passed away. They moved on. In other words, like a child whistling in the dark, right? We're saying, well, we have these phrases that we use as part of the day self. We'll just one day it'll come to an end, and that'll be that. Um, in Dasein's public way of interpreting, that is the day self, it is said that one dies because everyone else and oneself can talk himself into saying, in no case is it I myself, for this one is actually nobody, right? So the day self is a substitute for making something, individuating something. The day gives its approval and aggravates the temptation to cover up from oneself one's own most being towards death. So, elsewhere Heidegger talks about this business of leaping in, where one leaps in to the existence of another person and provides a sort of ready-made interpretation of what it is that they're going through. Well, you're feeling that way because of this, or, oh well, don't feel that way. Everybody has this. It's just a fleeting thing. And we do this with death also. What are you being so morbid about? Once you watch, a comedy or something. And yet, even in every average everydayness, he writes, this ownmost potentiality for being, which is non-relational and is not to be outstripped, is constantly an issue for Dasein. This is the case when its concern is merely in the mode of untroubled indifference towards the uttermost possibility of existence. So even here, even if it's covered over, we still know at some point that we are finite and that death defines our horizon of possibilities. To be certain of an entity means to hold it for true as something true, but truth signifies the uncoveredness of some entity, and all uncoveredness is grounded ontologically in the most primordial truth, the disclosedness of Dasein. So another one of his, kind of his riffs really, is that the correspondence theory of truth is derived from a more primordial kind of truth, which is that things are disclosed. And so there is obviously a truth about death, there are truths about death, but these themselves are grounded in a more primordial reality about death, the reality of human disclosedness about its fundamental condition, which is the fact that it is futurial. It knows from the moment it is aware, really, that death is on the horizon, and how do we rise to that challenge? There was a wonderful theologian, philosopher in the last century, Paul Tillich, wrote an excellent work taking off on this aspect of Heidegger. The Courage to Be was the title of his book, very obscure, hard to find actually, but I did come across a copy, and it's a fascinating argument, and sort of like the old adage, to be or not to be. At a certain point, this becomes something that needs to be grasped as one's own most possibility for something. And there are no guarantees, of course, as we've discussed, when it comes to having an authentic moment towards death. So he writes further, our everyday falling evasion in the face of death is an inauthentic being towards death. But inauthenticity is based on the possibility of authenticity. In other words, the child is like us, the children. We're whistling in the dark when it comes to death, but that itself reflects a prior knowledge that, don't ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for you and me. So even in inauthenticity, there's it itself is grounded on the unclosedness, disclosedness of Dasein as something to be to cope with and to come to terms with death. He writes further on in 304, the existential conception of death has been established, and therefore we have also established what it is that an authentic being towards the end should be able to comport itself towards. Dasein is constituted by disclosedness, that is, by an understanding with a state of mind. Okay, so he's setting us up here now for what death is in an authentic version. We already saw what the inauthentic one is. Death as possibility gives Dasein nothing to be actualized, obviously, nothing which Dasein as actual could itself be. In accordance with its essence, the possibility offers no support for becoming intent on something or picturing oneself, the actuality which is possible, and so forgetting its possibility. Being towards death as anticipation of possibility is what first makes this possibility possible and sets it free as a possibility. So what's he talking about there? Well, being towards death as an authentic mode means that I see that I'm finite. I see that death is an issue for me, and it kind of I'm looking at the future, and it's mirroring back to me, and it's focusing me on the fact that I do have possibilities here that can be informed by the fact of my death. So it puts me on the road to authenticity, an authentic approach towards death, if I can open that horizon to myself, not with platitudes and phrases, but directly. So more on this in a moment.